Greetings and hello. My name is Sean, also known as Rob Hagan in certain circles, and this is day 13 of my 2020 VEDA challenge. So it's a bit late on a Monday. I've had a bit of a long day. I had planned to record this a little earlier, but work was long and I was tired, and I said, no, I'm going to sleep. So here we are. Um, I've kind of been racking my brain trying to figure out what I wanted to talk about. There was an initial temptation to kind of do a counterbalance to what I talked about yesterday, and working that out, trying to record this hasn't it didn't click. But I thought I'd talk about something else. Sort of the influences I've had, some of the bigger influences I've had on my approach to creativity uh, over the years. I would probably say there are four big ones. Well, two individuals and two uh, mediums, media mediums that influenced me too. Of the two people, the first is Steven Spielberg. Uh, I'm a child of the '80s. I was born in '78 and grew up in the middle of the golden period of films in the '80s. So to say that I watched Steven Spielberg would be an understatement. I consumed it, like everybody my age, and uh, there's something in my head clicked with that. And as I got older, I dug a bit more into it. There's stuff that I had watched when I was a kid that I haven't watched since, and there's other stuff like, say, Indiana Jones that I've watched endlessly over and over again. And I've watched uh, his later films that were more serious and stuff like that. And it affected my attempts at creativity. Um, and there was a long period in my life where I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be Steven Spielberg, and I ultimately didn't. Um, I ended up veering into writing and history, more as my focus. But I can't argue to say that the first person I knew as a creative that influenced me was Steven Spielberg. And to this day, I could probably say Jaws is probably my favorite Steven Spielberg movie. I've seen it over 100 times. I have absorbed a lot of uh, secondary materials to it, books, video games, other movies. I am, oh, I could quote long passages of it, but that would be a very long tangent to this discussion. Yeah, so Steven Spielberg, my first big influence on me creatively. And the second one came a little bit later. Uh, it was one of the ones that was there, but I didn't realize it, and that's Stephen King. Uh, Vivid memory as a kid when we got our first VCR in the house. We rented two movies, my mom did. Uh, One was the original Friday the 13th, which I absolutely love, and that's a franchise that I love Friday the 13th a lot. And you'll notice a pattern here. I like things and I go into them and absorb a lot of information about them. Uh, and that's what I do. I honestly could argue, I think that's what most kids of the '80s are. We are sponges for uh, pop culture. Uh, but the other movie she rented was John Carpenter's Christine. And Carpenter's another guy who influenced me, but not to the extent that Stephen King did, bringing that around. And I remember being terrified of '50s cars for a while. I was probably, I was under 10 at the time. Uh, and eventually, you get over those sorts of things. It's funny enough, the Friday the 13th movie didn't terrify me when we went to summer camp. I wasn't afraid, you know. But yeah, so I kind of realized eventually when I got to high school, I'd been seeing Stephen King stuff most of my life. I had seen Carrie, I had seen Firestarter, Dead Zone. I didn't see The Shining, but I knew of all the Here's Johnny stuff. And um, when I was in high school, when I was a little bit, few years prior to that, I had seen the various ABC miniseries they were doing adapting his books. I remember it very vividly. I also remember it as a book because it was on one of my aunt's shelf. She actually had a pretty extensive collection of Stephen King materials. Um, like I said, I was in high school at the time. I think I was a freshman, and the Stand miniseries was coming up, and I was in, I think, the supermarket, and I saw on the shelf the Stand. It was in this copper-colored cover, and it had this guy, this sort of knight-looking guy, this medieval-looking guy fighting this crow being with a scythe, and I want that. And mom's like, you know, and I was like, yeah, well, you got your allowance. And yeah, I'm gonna go buy that. So I went and bought it, and I went home and I read it. I started reading it. I lugged that thing back and forth. Mind you, this was the version that was probably 1,100 pages. This was the unexpunged version that they released prior to the miniseries. Well, they released it a couple of years. They released it, like, I think in 1991, updated all the dates, and put a whole bunch of material back into the book. And I read that like cover to cover. It took me, I want to say, at least 4 or 5 days because I had to do schoolwork, I had to do other things, but I was reading that book every chance I got, and I didn't look back. Went to the school library, took out a whole bunch of different Stephen King things. Eventually, got some of my aunt's books that she had, and I just read and read and read and read and read. Like, I don't think I stopped reading Stephen King material till I was definitely out of high school. And in a lot of ways, I would probably say he's probably the single biggest influence on how I write. It's how I learned how to write dialogue and prose, how I learned to set up a scene or a location. A very big influence on my writing style. Surprisingly enough, long before he wrote his book on writing. And I aped that in my writing for a long time after that. And also, he became kind of my gateway into other realms of horror and weird fiction, Lovecraft and beyond. I probably would say, in terms of Stephen King materials, my favorite book is probably a toss-up between The Dead Zone and The Shining. I think they're both heads and shoulders above what you would expect. Considering that when I got older, I realized a lot of people called him, he was always a hacky horror writer. And again, I haven't read a lot of more recent stuff because it doesn't interest me. It's not that I don't like Stephen King anymore. I just sometimes you fall out of a thing. Same thing again, going back to Steven Spielberg. I haven't watched a lot of Richard Spielberg stuff, primarily because I'm into my own thing, and it's not nearly as big of a thing. I have to go see this. But yeah, so those are the two individual biggest influences I would say on me creatively. The other two are a bit more of a genre or media that have influenced me. One is comic books, which I think I mentioned when I was talking about superhero RPGs. About I was a avid comic book reader from, I think, just when I was still in elementary school. I was buying a lot of Spider-Man. I was reading a lot of DC, and a lot of that style of comic book writing influenced me. I again, much like I had with Spielberg, I wanted to be a filmmaker. There was a time where I wanted to be a comic book writer. I was not an artist. I will be upfront and admit that I can't draw to save a life. I can, if I'm sitting there and I'm bored, I'll doodle out a sketch and it might look like something. But trying to draw people and the patience it takes to do that is not something I've ever been able to properly develop. So I have no formal training as any kind of artist. I have learned how to storyboard a little bit, but I'm not an artist, and I don't pretend to be one. I think I showed in a previous thing, in this little thing, some of my attempts at art. They're very limited and very uninspired. And yeah, I mean, I think probably one of the things I did one at a time when I wanted to be a comic book writer is something that actually, because of my interest in comics, is I took a class in how to write comic books, how to create a comic book. I went to a class with a good friend of mine. The two of us had been sort of dabbling in developing a comic book setting, and I got a lot out of that. I learned the importance of storyboarding. I learned the importance of drafting your ideas down, of sort of having it not necessarily a full outline, but being able to know where you came from and where you're going. Uh, I mean, and to this day, I carry those lessons forward with me. So, as it, comic books were a big influence on my creative style. The other big thing was, and this one's like, this is a bit more vague, is role playing games. Now, you might say, well, you ran role playing games, like, how can that influence? Like, well, the thing is, all those other things, writing, film, comic books, the media you're creating is not interactive. It is very often you wrote something, someone reads it, they might have a reaction, but that isn't going to change how you tell the story, unless they write you a letter and you read it, and you know. But with a role playing game, very often you're presenting a scenario or a situation, and you might have a couple of ideas of how your players or the characters are going to react, but you don't have certainty. You don't have absolute control over the situation because they could think of something you didn't think of, and no game master can anticipate every possible outcome. Because sometimes it might be your players thinking about something, sometimes it might be your players making a role that you didn't expect them to make that completely changes how a story goes. And in playing and running role playing games, I learned that lesson. I learned how to improvise, how to react better to the unexpected. I would probably argue that if you talked to me before I was running a lot more games, I would become very frustrated if anyone said, "Oh, you should change this," in something you wrote, or if anybody took something I wrote and did something different with it, I'd be like, but that's not what I wrote. Why are you changing it? And but running role playing games, having to run stuff for a long period of time on a weekly basis for an audience of 3 or 4 who were interactive. They weren't just an audience; they were participants, and having to anticipate or figure out where we were going to go based on what they did taught me to improvise, taught me to accept that I may have a plan, I may have an idea, but something may come along and completely go, let's go this way. And creatively, that has helped me. That has allowed me to turn on a dime and go, okay, let's try this version, let's try this way. And I could give you examples and things I've written or things I've plotted out that I was going one way and a thought occurred to me and go, oh, let's go that way. But I wouldn't have had that thought. I'd be like, well, I already wrote this, I should continue. Like, no, we can scrap that. We can go an entirely different direction. And what role playing has brought to that. So I'm rambling a little bit, and my leg is kind of falling asleep on me right now. But that said, this has been me talking about my influences as a creative. There are others. I've hinted at them. Otherwise, I'd probably also say television was a huge influence on me. I watched a lot of TV as a kid. I would probably say there are shows that I can still recall to this day that some people don't. And it's like, why? It was on. I watched it. That's probably the fifth big influence on me as a creative is television. Just in general, being able to absorb a lot of different um, storytelling and not necessarily maybe influencing how I write, but how I approach things. Anyway, this has been a ramble, and again, it seems we have, looking at the little timer, we've shattered yet another length for these. Seem to be getting longer, probably because I'm getting a bit more comfortable, and the topic, I tend to get caught up in the subject. But that said, uh, I hope that you all are doing well, and I hope that you're feeling well. And my name is Sean, and until next time, I'll be seeing you, my friends. Have a good day.